So one day later, the painting is a little bit drier and I want to do a little bit more. Don't want to make the video run for too long, but this is something I haven't really demonstrated before, coming back to the painting when it's a little bit drier and trying to add some extra elements. I think what characterizes these mixed media studies for me is that they're very textured, and you often get patterns and textures in the papers, and then you build up the layers of the ink and the pastel, and that adds to the textural quality. What you might be trying to do with the painting is kind of the reverse, because often wet paint gives you something relatively smooth. And so what you're trying to do is inject a little bit more texture and pattern into the paint. So you can't see it all, but I had a bit of map here in the sky of my mixed media study, and that's got some peachy pale orange colours. So that's one thing I'm going to do. This area of sky is, if I rub it hard, some of that paint will come off on my fingers, but it's pretty dry. So I could just with a brush, and maybe with a dry brush actually, get on some of those colours. So if I'm kind of inspired by the colours that are in the mixed media study, then perhaps that's something I could do. Bit of dry brush. When you do dry brush, often you get a much more textured broken mark. So I might like that. Another thing I could do, I want to get a bit more light and colour into these trees. And that was all mixing when I worked with my brush. So now I'm just going to try it with the usual bits of card. That doesn't seem to be making much of an impact. So I need to get a better colour than that. There we go, that's something a bit brighter. So I find just by applying paint with card, you get a much more broken mark. You can't cover areas quite as easily. And in this situation, that's good, because you don't want to cover areas and produce something that's smooth. Some of the areas, for example, here this sign on the boathouse, the paint is quite thick and it's still consequently wet. So I'm scraping it down. So I've got my palette knife and I'm just doing it bit by bit, and I'm just holding it parallel to the surface of the painting so that I can lift off that wet paint. I don't know, because it's the red paint, maybe it doesn't dry. Paints, different colours dry at different rates. I always find the burnt umber dries very quickly, but maybe that red doesn't. So in order to get a bit of paint on there, I have lifted off some of the wet paint. And then I am going to maybe use a brush, I think. Possibly I should have used a smaller brush. But I'm going to restate some of that sign. But because I didn't scrape it all off, I've actually made a mixture that's a little bit duller and darker than what I started with. And I was hoping that that would mean I would have some areas that were quite bright, the old colour, and some areas a little bit more subdued. And similarly, down in the water, I just check if anything is still very wet. Just by actually scraping, you can very often add some texture, add some pattern. That isn't too bad. Most of that seems to have soaked in. And I wanted to again get a different kind of mark. What I've been working with a bit with the surface of the water are these slightly more horizontal short marks, which I think suggests something of the ripples on the water surface. So again, that's adding texture, and it's also adding a layer, because this is now sitting on top of the marks, the mainly dry marks that I made yesterday. And finally, I thought I'd try introducing one or two lines. So a little bit like the way I worked with ink. I've got, it's the proverbial one hairbrush. I've diluted some brown paint with the medium. I have to lean on something. With the medium, and I'm using a pretty thin brush, and I'm just introducing a few lines. And because the paint underneath is either dry and my line is a kind of transparent mixture, then it'll behave differently depending on what it runs across. Or in some places actually the paint isn't dry, and so there'll be a bit of mixing. So whichever it is, I have to keep cleaning that brush and getting back some fresh paint and just judging really how much of a consistent line I want and how much I want, or how much I'm happy to let things mix and merge. If it were completely dry, then I could put on my line, and if my line was too consistent, too definite, then I would just blot it with a rag and break it up again so that it was more integrated to the painting. So I've gone on far too long, but I wanted to try and illustrate some ways of going from the mixed media sketch, those layers of collage, ink and pastel, to layers of oil paint. So look forward to seeing what you can do with this material, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.